We come to the next section now as we begin to talk about the concept of fears. And the Bible mentions four basic categories of fears. And this is important for us in counseling because in order for us to distinguish how to help someone, we need to determine what kind of fear they are encountering at the time. And what I want you to discover as we go through this is that even though there are four basic types of fears, fears come in two real big categories. There are fears that have a definite external cause, which means you can trace it to something specifically outside of the person. And then there are fears or a fear that has no definite external cause, which means you can't trace the fear to anything definite outside the person because it's caused by something internal, which is the internal guilt. And so it's important to make that distinction between, is this a fear that has a definite external cause, which means I can trace it to something specifically, or is this a fear that doesn't have a definite external cause, which means it's traced to the internal guilt in one's heart. So with that being said, let's look at these four categories of fear. And what we're going to discover is that the first three categories of fear all fall in that camp of having a definite external cause, which means you can trace it to something specifically outside the person, where the last fear has no definite external cause. It is caused by internal guilt in the heart. So as we look at this, the Bible mentions four types of fears. The first type of fear we want to talk about is a fear, again, it's not sinful. It is a neutral fear, and it is a fear which has a definite external cause. It can be traced to something specifically externally. And this is what we call startle or fright. This is an instantaneous instinctual response to possible bodily danger. You step outside of a car and a cat jumps over your foot you weren't expecting to jump over your foot. Or you are in your car and someone almost runs you over because they're trying to get over, and then you have that initial startle of fright. That is not sinful fear. That is neutral fear. Now, what you do after that is something totally different. But that initial response, again, it has a definite external cause, and it's called startle of fright, and it is neutral. There's a second type of fear, which, again, these type of fears are good and right in the sight of God. They're not neutral, they're good and right. And these kind of fears have a definite external cause. They can be traced to something specifically external. These kind of fears are consistent with loving and trusting God. One of those would be the fear that is described as reverence for the Lord, as consistent with loving and trusting God. Fear that is described as concern is consistent with loving and trusting God. Fear that is described as respect, that is consistent with loving and trusting God. So think about it. We are to fear the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Paul said, I am fearful for you. He was saying, I'm concerned for you when he's talking to the Galatians. We'll look at Romans. We are to have a fear of those in leadership over us, which was used to talk about respect. So these are good and right fears, and they have a definite external cause. The third type of fears mentioned in the Bible are wrong and sinful fears, and they have a definite external cause, which means they can be traced to something that is external. And these fears are inconsistent with loving and trusting God. These are the sinful fears. This is having a fear of a false god. We are not to fear false gods. By the way, superstition in any shape, form, or fashion is a fear of a false god. Being worried, that is a fear that's inconsistent with loving and trusting God, because when you're worried, you're not focused on the God who's in control. You're consumed with losing something or not getting something that you treasure. Being timid or cowardly or being intimidated, that is a fear that's inconsistent with loving and trusting God. So notice we've mentioned three fears. We've mentioned the fear that's neutral, startle, and fright. We've mentioned the fear that's good and right, where we talk about fear of the Lord, reverence. We talked about fear being concerned. We talked about fear being respectful. And again, they have a definite external cause. You can trace it to something specifically external. And then we talked about these sinful fears, one of superstition, worry, and feeling intimidated by others. All of these fears, even though they're different in the sense that one is neutral, one is good, and one is bad, they all have a definite external cause. You can trace it to something specifically externally outside the person. The last type of fear we want to mention, this type of fear, it has no definite external cause. The Bible mentions another kind of fear, which is a byproduct of internal guilt. It does not have a discernible external cause. It is traced solely to internal guilt. It is it's called the fear of God's judgment. This is commonly known and called anxiety. Psychologists define anxiety as a fear which has no discernible external cause. They observe that it comes and goes for no external reason. There is no external apparent cause because it's a byproduct of a guilty conscience. Yet they probably would deny this as a reality. Again, the fear of God's judgment is seen in Adam when he sinned. It was not caused by anything external. It was a byproduct of his guilty conscience, which was the result of a sin choice. The fear of God's judgment is seen when people are running and no one is chasing them. The fear is not caused by anything external. It's a byproduct of a guilty conscience, which is the result of making a sin choice. The fear of God's judgment is not like any of the other fears because it's not something we control by choice. It's a byproduct of a choice. We don't deal with the fear of God's judgment through actually dealing with the fear, what a psychologist calls anxiety. We deal with it through confessing our sin. Now, this is important for you and I because the world uses the term anxiety a lot. And we've got to distinguish when they use the term anxiety, are they talking about worry or are they talking about apparently uncaused fear, which is the fear of God's judgment? When a person says, I'm having anxiety, but they can't tell you the definite external cause, they just say, I don't know, this anxiety is just coming and going, then they're talking about apparently uncaused fear or the fear of God's judgment, which means we've got to find the lack of love issue that's creating this to help them deal with it. If they say I'm having anxiety and you say, well, what are you anxious about? And they say, well, I'm anxious about the fact that I was late paying my light bill and they may cut my lights off. Well, that has a definite external cause, and they're talking about worry, and we help them deal with the sin of worry. Well, I hope this is important to you to see the distinction because we've got to be able to see when a person is talking about fear, what are they talking about? Two basic categories. First, a fear that has no definite cause is really due to internal guilt, and that's the apparently uncaused fear in the heart due to a guilty conscience, and they won't be able to trace that to anything external. This is where we get the anxiety attacks and the panic attacks. But for fear that has a definite external cause, that will be something that's either startle or fright, which is neutral. It'll be good fear, reverence, respect or concern, or will be bad fear, sinful fear, where there's worry, intimidation, or superstition. And so as we see this, they can help us to understand how to evaluate fear and how to deal with it in the lives of individuals. Keep studying, keep focusing, keep working through this material as we are learning the various aspects of fear.